You run your app through BrowserStack, and it passes on 50 devices. You check the newest Samsung, an older Pixel, 3 versions of Android you will never own, and every one of them comes back green, so you ship. Then a real customer in Singapore hits a wall your test matrix never saw, a login that will not send its code, a store page that shows the wrong country, a feature that quietly refuses to load. Nothing was wrong with your app on any device. The thing that broke was never a device at all. It was the network and the persistence underneath, and that is the layer this comparison is about. For context, I run real cloud Android phones in Singapore, over 100 dedicated Samsung handsets, each on its own persistent Singapore mobile IP from a real carrier SIM, each reachable over an ADB endpoint with an API and a live view you open in your browser. So this is my side of the table, and you should weigh the bias. I am not here to tell you to stop using BrowserStack, because for a large part of what it does, there is nothing better. I am here to be honest about the one seam where it stops fitting and a real dedicated phone starts. So here is the verdict before anything else. If your job is broad coverage, running one test suite across dozens of device models and Android versions you do not own, BrowserStack is the best tool money can buy, and a dedicated phone farm is not trying to compete with it. If your job needs a device that persists, a real Singapore carrier IP, or an identity that stays alive for months, a real handset that stays yours is the sturdier foundation. Most serious teams end up running both on purpose, and I will show you where the line sits. Let me say what BrowserStack is, fairly. It is a device cloud built for testing. You get a manual mode where you drive a real device in your browser to click through a build by hand, and an automation mode where your Appium or Espresso suite runs against that same fleet from your test pipeline. The whole pitch is breadth, hundreds of device and Android combinations sitting ready, so you never buy, charge, or store a single one of them. For a testing team, that is an enormous amount of hardware you get to skip owning, and that breadth is genuinely worth paying for. No small team should be buying 40 phones just to confirm a layout holds on a screen size they do not have, or that a build installs on an Android version 3 years old. BrowserStack turns a warehouse of devices into a line in your test pipeline, and for the wide regression sweep, the does it work everywhere pass, it delivers exactly what it promises. I want that said plainly before I get to the seam, because the seam is narrow and the breadth is real. Now the architecture, because everything else flows from it. A BrowserStack session is ephemeral by design. You request the device, you get a clean one from the shared pool, your app is installed, you do your run, and when the session ends, the device is wiped and handed to the next person in line. That reset is not a flaw, it is the entire point of a shared test cloud. Every tester deserves a fresh device with no leftovers from the last one, so the platform guarantees exactly that, a blank slate every single time. And let me be fair about the hardware, because this is where this comparison is different from the usual one. BrowserStack's real device cloud runs real devices. This is not an argument about emulators against real phones. The devices on the other side are genuine handsets too. The difference is not real against fake. It is shared and wiped against dedicated and persistent. And that single distinction is the whole conversation. So set the hardware realness question aside here. It is a tie. And look at what happens to state and to the network instead. Start with state, because a wiped session cannot keep any. The moment your run ends, the logged-in account is gone, the cookies are gone, the app data is gone, and the device is clean for the next tester. That is perfect when each test should start from nothing. It is the wrong tool the moment you need the same device tomorrow, with yesterday's session still alive, a warmed account still logged in, an app that remembers it has met this phone before. Persistence is not something you bolt onto an ephemeral session. It is a property you either have or you do not. From the network, which is where the seam is widest, a shared test cloud reaches the internet over its own cloud network, and any location you pick is usually simulated or tunneled rather than lived. That is completely fine for checking that your app renders and clicks. It is a different story the moment an app reads the actual network behind the connection and asks where this really came from. A simulated location and a real carrier IP are not the same evidence, and the apps that matter increasingly grade the evidence. With Cloudf.one, each phone has its own persistent Singapore mobile IP on a real carrier SIM, Singtel, StarHub, M1, or Vivifeed. That is not a Singapore label attached to a cloud device somewhere else. It is a phone physically sitting on a Singapore carrier network. An app that cares about location reads the network behind the login and sees a real resident mobile connection, because that is exactly what it is. For anything geosensitive, that gap between a simulated location and a lived one is the difference between a test that reflects your real user and a test that does not. This is not theoretical. It is a specific list of things that only behave correctly on a real Singapore network. Localized store listings and the ranking a Singapore user actually sees. Geo-pricing that changes by country, carrier billing flows that only exist on a real carrier, an SMS code or a one-time OTP arriving on a real Singapore number seated in the phone, and apps that simply refuse connections they judge to come from a cloud network rather than a resident one. None of those are things a wiped cloud network session can show you honestly, and there is a whole class of work that a test cloud was never built to hold at all. Anything that lives as a persistent identity, an account you keep warm for months, a device that has to be the same device every time a platform checks, a login history that has to read as one steady real phone, that is not testing, it is operating, and you cannot operate on a device that gets wiped between sessions. This is not a knock on BrowserStack, it is simply a job outside what a test matrix is for. So let me say plainly what Cloud.one is. Real Samsung handsets racked in Singapore, over 100 of them, each one dedicated to a single customer at a time rather than shared and wiped. Every phone has its own SIM and its own persistent Singapore mobile IP. You drive it three ways: a live browser view for hands-on work, so the phone in the rack behaves like the phone in your hand, an ADB endpoint over the network for automation, and an API to list your phones and lock one to a job. There is no breadth magic here, it is one real phone that stays yours. And for testing, the tools you already know still work. Your Appium suite drives the real handset over that ADB endpoint exactly as it would drive a session in a cloud. A UE automator or espresso run points at the same device, and your scripts do not care that the phone is dedicated instead of shared. The difference the tooling does not see is that the device persists, keeps its state, and answers from a real Singapore carrier IP run after run. Same automation, a different foundation underneath it. Now the honest trade-off, because a dedicated phone is not free of one. Cloud.one will not hand you 50 device models and 100 Android versions on demand, and it is not trying to. If your actual need is broad metrics coverage, confirming a build behaves across a wide spread of hardware you do not own, that is BrowserStack's job, and a rack of dedicated phones is the wrong shape for it. I would rather tell you that than pretend one tool wins every row. Which is why the real answer for a lot of teams is both. Pointed at the jobs each is built for. Run the wide regression sweep on BrowserStack, the does it install, does it render, does it click pass across the device spread. Then run the narrow, load-bearing work on a dedicated Singapore phone. The geo-sensitive checks, the real carrier flows, the persistent account, the same device a platform expects to see again tomorrow. The mistake is forcing the persistent Singapore-specific work through the ephemeral cloud just because the account was already open. And be clear-eyed about what you are paying for on the dedicated side. A real handset takes up rack space, needs a real SIM that costs money every month, and cannot be conjured 100 at a time the way a fresh cloud session can. You are not paying for breadth, you are paying for persistence and for a real carrier IP that reads as a resident of Singapore. Those are the two things a shared test cloud structurally cannot give you, and they are the only reasons to reach for a dedicated phone instead. One boundary, stated plainly because it matters. Whatever you run on a real phone, keep it legitimate and rule-following, your own apps, your own accounts, your own clients, inside the terms you agreed to. A real dedicated device does not make anything acceptable that would not be acceptable on a shared one. This is a tool for honest operators and testers who need the device and the network to be genuinely real, not a way around a control that exists for a good reason. So that is the reason Cloud.one exists. Real Samsung handsets in Singapore on dedicated hardware, each with its own persistent Singapore mobile IP on a real carrier SIM, Singtel, StarHub, M1, or Vivify across prepaid and postpaid lines. Not an emulator, not a data center address, not a location label bolted onto a device somewhere else. A genuine phone you reach over an ADB endpoint, drive through an API, and control live in your browser. Start at Cloud.one and use code YT30 on your first month. So to recap, BrowserStack is a device cloud built for breadth and for running one test suite across dozens of devices and Android versions you do not own. It is the best tool there is. But its sessions are ephemeral, and its network is a cloud network, so it cannot keep state and cannot give you a real Singapore carrier IP. Cloud. One anchors the other side, one real Samsung handset that stays yours, with persistent state and a persistent Singapore mobile IP. For the geo-sensitive carrier real, long-lived work a wiped session cannot hold. Sort your work by whether it needs breadth or needs a real persistent Singapore device. Put each half where it belongs, and there is nothing stopping you running both. Build the dedicated layer for the work that has to be real all the way down, and let the test cloud do the wide sweep it is great at. I'll see you in the next one.